Dr. Nathan Cross traveled from town to town across the Colorado Territory with a horse-drawn wagon full of dental tools and a promise to cure any toothache. But when federal investigators finally caught up with him in 1884, they discovered that the gentle dentist had been extracting far more than teeth from his patients. Hidden in the false bottom of his dental chair were government documents, corruption evidence, and secrets that could topple the territorial government, all whispered to him by patients under the influence of his special anesthetic. The sign painted on the side of Dr. Nathan Cross's medical wagon was simple and straightforward: painless dentistry, no charge for consultation. As his mule-drawn wagon rolled into mining camps, cattle towns, and frontier settlements throughout Colorado Territory, the sound of its squeaking wheels was often the first indication that relief from dental agony had finally arrived. In an era when tooth pain could mean death from infection and most frontier communities had no access to professional medical care, Dr. Cross was greeted like a miracle worker wherever he appeared. Nathan Cross looked exactly like what he claimed to be: a dedicated traveling dentist committed to bringing modern medical care to the American frontier. At 37 years old, he was a small, meticulous man with gentle hands and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a scholar who had traded books for forceps. His voice was soft and reassuring, his manner patient and kind, and his dedication to helping people seemed absolute. Patients who had been suffering for months with infected teeth would weep with gratitude after Nathan had relieved their pain with techniques that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness. But there was something unusual about Dr. Cross's practice that patients noticed only in retrospect, if they noticed it at all. His consultations were extraordinarily thorough, lasting much longer than seemed necessary for dental work. He asked detailed questions about patients' lives, their work, their families, and their communities. Most remarkably, he used an anesthetic that was far more powerful than anything other frontier doctors could provide, often rendering patients completely unconscious for procedures that seemed relatively minor. What Dr. Cross's patients didn't realize was that while they were unconscious, they were talking. His special anesthetic contained a combination of ether and other compounds that not only eliminated pain, but also created a state of relaxed unconsciousness in which patients would freely discuss anything that came to mind. And Dr. Cross had developed an extraordinary talent for guiding these unconscious conversations toward topics that had nothing to do with dentistry and everything to do with the corruption and criminal activities that plagued Colorado Territory. The man calling himself Dr. Nathan Cross was actually Nathan Wesley, a former investigative journalist who had been secretly recruited by the United States Department of Justice to conduct undercover operations against corrupt government officials, criminal organizations, and foreign agents operating in the American West. His mission was to gather evidence of crimes that local law enforcement agencies either couldn't or wouldn't investigate, often because they were complicit in the illegal activities themselves. The choice to assume the identity of a traveling dentist had been inspired in its simplicity and effectiveness. Dental pain was one of the few medical conditions that could compel even the most suspicious and secretive people to seek professional help. A dentist's office was one of the few places where powerful men would willingly make themselves vulnerable, and the use of anesthetics provided a perfect opportunity to extract information along with infected teeth. Nathan's dental skills were completely genuine. He had spent 2 years studying at the Philadelphia Dental College before being recruited for intelligence work. His commitment to providing real medical care was absolute, both because it maintained his cover identity and because he genuinely cared about relieving human suffering. But his most valuable skill was his ability to conduct interrogations so subtle that his subjects never realized they were being questioned. The intelligence that Nathan gathered during his years as Dr. Cross was staggering in its scope and detail. From his dental chair, he learned about corruption schemes involving territorial judges who were taking bribes to rule in favor of mining companies. He discovered evidence of sheriffs who were being paid to ignore cattle rustling operations run by supposedly respectable ranchers. He uncovered connections between legitimate businesses and criminal organizations that were robbing banks, hijacking shipments, and murdering competitors. Most shocking of all, Nathan's unconscious patients revealed the existence of a conspiracy involving territorial government officials who were selling land rights, mineral claims, and government contracts to foreign investors, often using information obtained through their official positions to defraud American citizens and legitimate businesses. The scope of Nathan's operation was remarkable. His dental wagon was equipped with a sophisticated filing system hidden beneath false floors and behind secret panels. Every conversation he recorded was carefully categorized and cross-referenced with information obtained from other patients, allowing him to build comprehensive maps of criminal networks and corruption schemes throughout the territory. Nathan's anesthetic techniques allowed him to control not only the depth of his patients' unconsciousness, but also their ability to remember what they had discussed while under his care. Most patients retained no memory of their conversations, believing they had simply fallen asleep during routine dental procedures. But Nathan had developed methods for ensuring that certain patients would remember specific information, allowing him to plant suggestions or warnings that would influence their future behavior. The intelligence network that Nathan built around his dental practice was extraordinarily sophisticated. He recruited informants among his patients, often people who had been victims of the corruption he was investigating. He established communication systems with other undercover agents operating throughout the territory. Most importantly, he developed relationships with legitimate law enforcement officers and federal officials who could act on the evidence he provided. Nathan's most valuable asset was his ability to travel freely throughout Colorado territory without arousing suspicion. As a traveling dentist, he was welcomed in every community and had legitimate reasons to visit even the most remote mining camps and isolated ranches. His medical skills earned him the trust and gratitude of people at every level of frontier society, from powerful cattle barons to immigrant miners. The breadth of Nathan's intelligence gathering was unprecedented for a single operative. Over 6 years, he documented evidence of criminal activities involving more than 200 individuals, including territorial judges, federal land agents, military officers, business leaders, and foreign operatives. His files contained detailed maps of criminal networks, financial records of illegal transactions, and documented proof of corruption schemes that extended all the way to Washington, D.C. But Nathan's success came at an enormous personal cost. Living as Dr. Cross required him to maintain absolute emotional detachment from the people whose trust he was systematically betraying. He had to provide genuine medical care to criminals whose activities he was secretly documenting. He had to accept the gratitude of patients who considered him a hero while knowing that his real purpose was to gather evidence that might ultimately send them to prison. The psychological strain of conducting hundreds of unconscious interrogations while maintaining the facade of a caring medical professional was almost unbearable. Nathan began to suffer from insomnia, anxiety, and periods of deep depression that threatened his ability to continue his mission. He struggled with guilt over the deception he was practicing on people who genuinely needed medical care and who trusted him completely. Nathan's operation faced constant danger from multiple sources. Corrupt officials who suspected they were being investigated began looking for federal agents and informants. Criminal organizations started conducting their own counterintelligence operations, trying to identify anyone who might be gathering evidence against them. Foreign agents working in the territory developed sophisticated techniques for detecting and eliminating American intelligence operatives. The crisis that would ultimately expose Nathan's activities began in 1883, when several territorial officials noticed patterns in law enforcement activities that suggested someone was providing detailed intelligence about their criminal operations. Federal raids and arrests were occurring with suspicious timing and accuracy, as if authorities knew exactly when and where to find evidence of illegal activities. A coalition of corrupt officials and criminal leaders hired private investigators to identify the source of intelligence leaks that were disrupting their operations. These investigators began systematically reviewing the activities of anyone who had regular contact with government officials, business leaders, and other potential sources of sensitive information. Dr. Nathan Cross came under suspicion because his traveling practice gave him access to a wide range of people throughout the territory, and several of his patients have been arrested shortly after receiving dental treatment. The investigators began conducting surveillance of Nathan's activities, looking for evidence that he was more than just a simple traveling dentist. The breakthrough in the investigation came when one of the private investigators managed to examine Nathan's dental wagon while he was treating patients in a remote mining camp. The investigator discovered the hidden filing systems and documented evidence that Nathan was systematically gathering information that had nothing to do with dentistry. Nathan became aware that his cover had been compromised when several of his regular patients began asking suspicious questions about his background and training. Warning signs included unusual interest in his dental techniques, requests to examine his equipment, and attempts to verify his credentials with dental schools and professional organizations. Recognizing that his operation was in immediate danger, Nathan began implementing emergency procedures he had developed for exactly this situation. His first priority was to ensure that the evidence he had gathered reached federal authorities before he could be captured or killed by the people he had been investigating. Nathan's escape from Colorado Territory was a masterpiece of preparation and timing. Over his years of travel, he had developed detailed knowledge of remote trails, hidden campsites, and sympathetic contacts throughout the region. He had also established multiple backup identities and communication systems that would allow him to continue his work even if his cover as Dr. Cross was blown. But Nathan's most critical task was protecting the intelligence he had gathered and ensuring that it could be used to prosecute the criminals and corrupt officials he had been investigating. The evidence he had collected represented years of dangerous work and could potentially lead to the largest corruption prosecutions in territorial history. Nathan's solution was both desperate and brilliant. Rather than trying to transport physical documents that could be seized if he was captured, he had memorized the most critical information and had developed methods for hiding key evidence in locations where federal agents could retrieve it later. His dental equipment was modified to contain hidden compartments where documents could be concealed, and his wagon was equipped with secret panels that would be virtually impossible for searchers to detect. The pursuit of Dr. Nathan Cross across Colorado Territory became one of the most intensive manhunts in the region's history. Corrupt officials and criminal leaders mobilized hundreds of men to track down the traveling dentist who had gathered evidence of their illegal activities. Bounties were offered for Nathan's capture, and every settlement in the territory was searched for signs of his distinctive medical wagon. But Nathan's years of traveling throughout the region had given him advantages that his pursuers couldn't match. He knew every trail, every water source, and every hiding place in Colorado Territory. More importantly, he had the support of grateful patients who were willing to risk their lives to protect the man who had relieved their suffering. Nathan's escape took 3 months and covered more than 800 miles of some of the most dangerous terrain in the American West. He was pursued through mountain passes, across desert wasteland, and through territory controlled by hostile Native American tribes. Several times he was nearly captured, escaping only through a combination of luck, preparation, and the assistance of people who owed him their lives. The final confrontation came when Nathan reached the Colorado-Kansas border, where federal agents were waiting to provide him with protection and escort him to safety. But corrupt territorial officials had anticipated this possibility and had positioned their own men to intercept Nathan before he could reach federal protection. The gunfight that ensued became legendary throughout the frontier, not just for its violence, but for the unlikely alliances it revealed. Nathan found himself protected not just by federal agents, but by dozens of former patients who had traveled hundreds of miles to ensure his safety. Cowboys, miners, ranchers, and townspeople who had benefited from his dental care formed an impromptu army to defend the man who had helped them. When the shooting ended, Nathan was safely in federal custody, and the evidence he had gathered was secured by Department of Justice agents. But the cost had been enormous. Several of his defenders had been killed, and Nathan himself had been wounded in the crossfire. The trials that resulted from Nathan's intelligence work lasted for more than 2 years and resulted in the prosecution of over 100 individuals for corruption, conspiracy, and criminal activities. Territorial judges were removed from office, federal land agents were imprisoned, and business leaders who had been involved in criminal enterprises saw their operations dismantled. Most importantly, Nathan's work exposed connections between local corruption and national political figures, leading to investigations that reached all the way to Congress and resulted in significant reforms in how territorial governments were administered and supervised. But Nathan Wesley never practiced dentistry again. The psychological toll of his years as Dr. Cross had been too great, and he was no longer able to maintain the emotional detachment that intelligence work required. Instead, he was quietly transferred to a desk job in Washington, D.C., where he spent his remaining years analyzing intelligence reports and training other undercover operatives. The legend of Dr. Nathan Cross lived on throughout Colorado Territory long after the real Nathan Wesley had disappeared from public view. Stories were told of the gentle dentist who had relieved pain and exposed corruption, of the mysterious medical man who had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. Children would claim to hear the squeaking wheels of his wagon on quiet nights, and adults would speak in hushed tones about the day when justice had arrived disguised as dental care. Nathan's modified dental wagon was preserved by the federal government as an example of innovative intelligence techniques, but it was never displayed publicly. The equipment he had used to conduct unconscious interrogations was studied by government scientists and led to advances in both medical anesthesia and intelligence gathering that would be used for decades to come. The people of Colorado Territory gradually learned the truth about Dr. Nathan Cross, but their gratitude remained unchanged. He had provided genuine medical care to people who desperately needed it, and he had risked his life to expose corruption that was harming their communities. The fact that he had been conducting intelligence operations while treating their teeth only added to their admiration for his courage and dedication. Years later, when Colorado became a state and began establishing its own historical records, the story of Dr. Nathan Cross was carefully preserved as an example of how individual courage could triumph over systematic corruption. But the full details of his intelligence work remained classified, known only to a few federal officials who understood the precedent his success had set for future undercover operations. Nathan Wesley died in 1923 at the age of 76, having lived to see the territory he had served become a prosperous state with honest government and effective law enforcement. His funeral was attended by dozens of people who had traveled from across the West to pay their respects to the man who had once been Dr. Cross. Among them were former patients who still remembered the day their dental pain had been relieved by the gentlest hands in Colorado Territory. The dental tools that Nathan had used during his years as Dr. Cross were donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where they remain on display as examples of frontier medical equipment. But visitors to the museum have no way of knowing that these simple instruments had once been used to extract government secrets along with infected teeth, or that the man who wielded them had single-handedly exposed the largest corruption scandal in territorial history. The story of Dr. Nathan Cross reminds us that heroes often work in disguise, that justice sometimes requires deception, and that the most powerful weapons against corruption are often the simplest tools of human trust and vulnerability. His legacy lives on in every person who chooses to risk their safety to expose wrongdoing, and in every community that benefits from the courage of individuals who are willing to sacrifice their own comfort for the greater good. The traveling dentist who pulled more than teeth had indeed extracted government secrets, but more importantly, he had pulled out the root of corruption that was poisoning an entire territory. His work proved that sometimes the most effective way to clean up society is to start by cleaning up the painful infections that people prefer to ignore.